The classroom was noisy, full of chatter and laughter, but not the kind of laughter that comes from happiness. It was the kind of laughter that carried a sharp edge, the kind that cut someone's heart. In the middle of this room sat a quiet boy, different from the others, not because of how he looked, but because of how he behaved. He was calm, shy, and always tried to stay away from trouble. His skin was darker than most of the students, and for that alone, some of the teachers. And classmates treated him unfairly. Every day felt like a test of endurance for him. The teachers, who should have been guiding lights, were sometimes the ones who allowed cruelty to bloom. They didn't always shout at him, but their mocking smiles and harsh remarks were louder than any scolding. The boy had learned to sit still, keep his head down, and hope the day would pass without too much pain. But fate had something different planned for him on this particular day. It all started when the piano in the corner of the classroom caught one teacher's eye. It was old, dusty, and rarely used. The students sometimes banged on it during breaks, but no one really cared about music. That day, however, one of the teachers decided to turn it into a tool for humiliation. The teacher looked around the class, eyes scanning for someone to make fun of, and of course, they landed on the quiet boy who never fought back. "Hey you," the teacher said with a smirk, pointing directly at him. The boy froze, his stomach sinking. "Come here, sit at the piano." The entire classroom erupted in laughter. Some kids slapped their desks, whispering cruel jokes, waiting to see him embarrassed. The boy's heart began to beat faster. He didn't want to go, but he knew refusing would only make things worse. Slowly, he stood up, his legs heavy as if they were chained. Every step he took toward the piano felt like a long walk of shame. He could feel eyes piercing into his back, hear giggles bubbling up from every corner. He wanted to disappear, to vanish into thin air. But the teacher's stare forced him forward until he reached the piano and sat down on the hard teen. Ruby kiss, only ruby kiss. Only ruby kiss has the luxurious texture that glides on. 60 wooden bench. The teacher folded their arms, clearly enjoying the moment. "Play something for us," they said, their voice dripping with mockery. The class burst into laughter again. The boy's hands shook as he rested them on his lap. He hadn't touched this piano before in front of anyone here. No one knew that late at night in his small home, he sometimes practiced on a borrowed keyboard. No one knew he carried music in his heart, music that gave him strength when the world seemed too cruel. To the class, he was just a quiet boy with no voice. One of the students shouted, "Play something funny so we can laugh more." Another added, "He doesn't even know how to press a key." The comments stung like needles. The boy lowered his head, wishing the floor would open up and swallow him whole. The teacher leaned against the desk, smirking. "What's wrong? Afraid? Don't keep us waiting." Their words were cruel, designed to push him into a corner. The room grew louder, filled with taunts and giggles. The boy's ears burned, his heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the weight of every laugh, every insult pressing down on him. He thought of running, thought of shaking his head and saying, "No," but something inside him whispered that this was his moment, whether he liked it or not. He looked at the piano. The keys were chipped and dusty, but they still called out to him. Memories of his late-night practice sessions filled his mind, the way his fingers moved over melodies, the way music helped him forget the pain of the day. He took a deep breath. Trying to silence the chaos around him, the class continued to laugh, expecting a disaster, expecting him to fail. The teacher, arms crossed, believed this would be just another story to laugh about in the staff room. But deep down, the boy knew something they didn't know. They had pushed him into a corner, but in that corner lay his greatest strength as he sat there. Gathering courage, the room suddenly felt both loud and strangely quiet. Loud because of the laughter, but quiet because inside his heart everything else faded away. It was just him and the piano now. The boy, once the target of cruelty, was about to make a choice: either let them break him with laughter, or rise and show them the truth hidden behind his silence. And so, the stage was set. A classroom filled with cruelty, a piano turned into a weapon of mockery, and a boy caught in the middle of it all. None of them, not the teachers, not the students, not even the boy himself, truly knew what was about to happen next. The boy sat stiffly on the piano bench, his back straight, his hands resting on his lap. The entire classroom had turned into a stage, and every pair of eyes was locked on him, not with kindness, not with encouragement, but with hunger for his humiliation. The students leaned forward in their seats, whispering and chuckling, waiting to watch him stumble. The teachers, who should have been protectors, wore smug smiles, ready to see the boy make a fool of himself. The teacher in charge tapped the piano lid with a ruler. The sound sharp and cold. "Go on," the teacher said, their voice cutting through the air. "Play something. Don't waste our time." The boy's heart raced. He wanted to protest, to say he didn't want to play, but the words stuck in his throat. His voice, small and fragile, had always been drowned out by laughter. He had learned that speaking up often made things worse. So instead of arguing, he lifted his hands slowly and placed them above the keys. The laughter grew louder. One student shouted, "Look at his hands. They're shaking like twigs in the wind." Another giggled, "He probably doesn't even know where middle C is." The comment stung each one like a slap across his face. But he didn't pull his hands back. He just stared at the keys, breathing slowly, as if trying to draw courage from their worn, black and white surface. For a long moment, he did nothing. The classroom's laughter began to fade into impatience. Some students started tapping their feet. The teacher sighed loudly. "Any day now," the teacher muttered. "Or are you too scared to even try?" The boy closed his eyes. He remembered the nights at home when he sat alone in his tiny room with an old second-hand keyboard his mother had given him. It was scratched and missing keys, but it was his. In those moments, when the world was asleep, he played quietly to himself. Music had become his secret refuge, a place no one could touch, a place where no laughter could follow him. But now, that secret was being forced into the light. He pressed a single key. The sound rang out, soft and uncertain. The class burst into loud laughter, clapping mockingly. "Wow, what talent!" One boy shouted sarcastically. Another girl cupped her hands around her mouth and yelled, "Encore!" The room shook with cruel laughter. The boy's face burned red. He wanted to disappear, but something deep inside pushed against the shame. He pressed another key, then another. The notes were uneven at first, his fingers trembling, but slowly the rhythm began to form. The laughter softened, just slightly. A few students tilted their heads, noticing something different in the way his fingers moved. The teacher frowned, tapping the ruler against their hand impatiently. But even they could sense that something unusual was stirring. The boy straightened his back. His hands began to move with more confidence, flowing across the keys. He was no longer pressing random notes, he was playing a melody, one he had practiced countless times in the silence of his room. The sound grew stronger, clearer, as if his heart had found its voice. The students exchanged glances. Some smirked, but others began to fall quiet, listening despite themselves. The boy's music carried a strange weight, something honest, something raw. It was not perfect, but it was real. Still, the teacher smirked, unwilling to admit surprise. "Enough," the teacher started to say, but the boy didn't stop. His fingers moved faster, pouring out feelings he had kept locked inside for so long. Every note seemed to push back against the ridicule. Every chord silenced another cruel laugh. The classroom had set a trap for him, but he was beginning to turn it into his stage. The students who had been ready to laugh now sat stunned, unsure whether to sneer or to listen. The boy's eyes were still closed, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm. For the first time, he didn't see their mocking faces. He didn't hear their cruel voices. All he heard was the music flowing from his own soul. The teacher shifted uncomfortably, realizing this was no longer going as planned. What was meant to be a moment of ridicule was slowly becoming something else, and as the boy continued to play, the balance in the room began to change. The power was shifting. The same piano that had been forced upon him as a weapon of humiliation was becoming his shield, his sword, and his voice. None of them knew it yet, but the boy was about to leave them speechless. Asterisk the laughter that had. Once filled, the room was fading now, replaced by a strange, uneasy quiet. The boy sat on the piano bench, eyes still closed, his hands hovering above the keys. He hadn't yet shown the full depth of what he could do, but something in the way he held himself was different. The students noticed it. The teachers noticed it. The air itself seemed to grow heavier, as though the room was holding its breath, waiting for something it didn't understand. The boy's fingers trembled slightly. He wasn't afraid anymore, at least, not in the same way. His fear had transformed into something else, something sharper. It was courage mixed with pain, determination born from years of being overlooked. He knew this moment would decide everything. Either he would stay the boy they laughed at, or he would become something none of them could ignore. He pressed a few soft keys, testing the sound. The notes echoed faintly, fragile as whispers. Couple of students chuckled, thinking it was just luck. But then they saw his face. His eyes were still shut tight, his lips pressed together, and his head tilted slightly toward the keys, as if he was listening to a voice no one else could hear. Inside his mind, he was no longer in that cruel classroom. He was in his room at night, the only light coming from the small lamp on his desk. He could hear the creaking of the old chair he always sat on, the sound of his mother humming softly in the kitchen. He could feel the safe silence of home, where no one mocked him, where music belonged only to him. That memory gave him strength. Slowly, his hands began to move. The notes flowed together, no longer scattered or uneven. It was still soft, almost hesitant, like the beginning of a story. But there was something in those notes and emotion that silenced the whispers. The students leaned forward, out, their laughter caught in their throats. The teacher who had forced him to play shifted in their seat, frowning, as if unsure what was happening. The boy played as though the piano was speaking for him. Each note carried weight, a piece of his heart. The melody was not flashy or loud. It was gentle, deep, and haunting. It carried sorrow, as though every insult, every cruel laugh had been woven into the music. For the first time, the classroom wasn't laughing. They were listening. The boy's shoulders relaxed, and his body swayed with the rhythm. He was no longer performing for them. He was playing for himself. Every note was like a breath of relief, like he was finally telling the story he had never been able to say out loud. The room grew quieter still. You could hear the creak of a chair, the faint hum of the lights above, even the sound of someone swallowing nervously. The laughter was gone, replaced by a thick silence that no one dared to break. The teacher tapped their fingers against the desk, trying to act unimpressed, but even they couldn't deny the change in the room. The boy's music had created something powerful, something the teacher had not expected. His hands moved faster now, no longer trembling. The melody rose higher, stronger, until it filled every corner of the classroom. It wasn't just music, it was emotion. It was his life poured into sound, the loneliness of sitting alone, the sting of cruel words, The quiet pride of teaching himself something beautiful when no one believed in him. The students who had once mocked him sat frozen. Some stared wide-eyed. Others bit their lips as though ashamed of what they had said before. The boy had not spoken a single word, but somehow, through the piano, he was telling them everything. The teacher cleared their throat, about to interrupt, but stopped. Even they couldn't bring themselves to break the spell. The boy pressed a low, deep chord, and the room seemed to vibrate. His eyes remained closed, his face calm, almost peaceful. He looked like he had finally found his place, not in their acceptance, but in his own strength. The music slowed, softening again, drifting into a fragile silence. For a moment, the room remained utterly still. The students held their breath. Even the teacher, who had wanted to mock him, couldn't find a word. The boy lifted his hands from the keys, letting the last note linger in the air. His eyes opened. Slowly, he looked around at the classroom, and for the first time, it wasn't filled with laughter. It was filled with silence, pure, stunned silence. He had not played his masterpiece yet. He had only given them a glimpse. But that glimpse was enough to shake the entire room. They had expected weakness. Instead, they saw power, and deep down, every single person in that classroom knew the best was still to come. The room was frozen. Every pair of eyes locked on the boy. What had started as a cruel game was turning into something no one expected. He sat on the piano bench, still and focused, as if the keys belonged to him and only him. His eyes remained closed, but his fingers were alive, trembling at first, then steady, then bold. The first strong chord struck like a clap of thunder in the silence. It wasn't just a sound, it was a declaration. His hands began to move faster, and the music poured out with a force that stunned everyone. The students leaned back in their seats. The laughter that once echoed in the classroom had vanished completely. No one dared to whisper now. Every note seemed to demand silence, respect, and awe. The boy swayed slightly as he played, carried away by the melody. It wasn't just practice showing through it, it was passion, raw and undeniable. His music told a story. There was sadness in it, like the sting of every cruel word he had endured. There was anger, hidden but sharp, striking through in sudden, powerful chords. But above all, there was beauty. A beauty that no mockery could erase. One by one, the students' mocking expressions faded. Jaws dropped. A few eyes widened, glistening with emotions they didn't understand. This wasn't just a boy fumbling with a piano. This was a boy revealing a part of his soul, and none of them were ready for it. The teacher who had forced him to play tapped their fingers nervously against the desk. At first, they tried to smirk, to hold on to their authority, but the music was stronger than their pride. Even they felt the weight of it pressing against their chest, a truth they could not deny. The boy's hands moved like water, flowing across the keys with precision. Sometimes fast, sometimes slow, sometimes soft, sometimes thunderous. The melody shifted like emotions, rising and falling, hope, chasing sorrow, courage, battling fear. It was as if he was speaking in a language beyond words, one that everyone could understand. The classroom changed. The air grew heavy, filled with something no one could describe. It wasn't just music, it was power. It was the kind of power that makes people stop, listen, and feel. A girl in the back, who had laughed the loudest, now sat with her mouth slightly open. She felt her throat tighten, tears threatening to form, though she didn't know why. A boy who had shouted insults earlier was staring at the piano, his fists clenched. Ashamed of what he had said, the boy's music kept rising, climbing higher and higher, until it seemed to fill not just the classroom, but the whole building. It was fearless, defiant, unstoppable. He wasn't just playing for them anymore, he was playing for every moment they had tried to break him. Every note was his answer. His proof that he was more than their cruelty. He struck the keys with a strength that shook the old piano. The sound rolled through the room like a storm. Then, suddenly, he pulled back, letting the melody soften, delicate as falling rain. The contrast left everyone breathless. His body moved with the rhythm, his head tilting gently, as though he was lost. Inside the music, he was no longer the quiet boy they thought they knew. He was a musician, a storyteller, a fighter. The piano was no longer a tool for ridicule. 'Twas his weapon, his shield, his voice. The students sat completely still, afraid to break the spell. Even the teacher, who had started this cruel test, was silent, their face pale and uneasy. They had wanted to make him small, but instead, they had given him the stage he deserved. The melody built again, rising towards something greater. Every note was like a spark, lighting up the room, burning away the cruelty that had filled it before. The boy's fingers flew across the keys, faster, stronger, unstoppable now. Then came the moment. A long, rolling chord filled the air, shaking the very walls. It was the climax of everything he had endured, everything he had carried inside. He poured it all into that sound, his pain, his strength, his hope, his pride. The music slowed, but not weakly. It slowed with grace, with control, as though he was gently laying down his soul for them to see. His fingers caressed the final notes, soft and tender, until the last sound faded into silence. No one moved, no one spoke. The classroom, once filled with cruel laughter, now sat in stunned silence. The boy opened his eyes at last, breathing deeply. He looked around the room, and for the first time, it wasn't full of enemies. It was full of people who had been silenced not by fear, but by awe. He had played not just to survive their ridicule, but to rise above it. And now, they all knew. They had forced him onto the bench to humiliate him, but instead, they had uncovered his gift. The boy's hands rested gently on his lap. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The silence of the room was his victory. Asterisk, the last note of his music, still lingered in the air like a ghost that refused to leave. The boy's hands rested quietly on the keys, but the sound of his playing echoed inside every heart in the room. The silence that followed was unlike any silence the classroom had ever known. It wasn't empty. It was heavy, full, alive. The students who had been ready to laugh at his humiliation now sat frozen. Their eyes were wide, their mouths half open, as if words had been stolen from them. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure what to do. Others leaned forward without realizing it, their bodies drawn toward him as though the music still pulled them closer. The teacher who had forced him to play swallowed hard, their smug smile gone. They had expected stumbles, wrong notes, clumsy hands. Instead, they had witnessed something far greater than they could explain. A strange feeling crawled into their chests, something close to shame. But mixed with disbelief, the boy slowly lifted his eyes from the piano and looked around the room. For the first time, no one mocked him. No one laughed. His gaze met theirs, and they quickly looked away, unable to meet the calm strength in his eyes. The transformation was undeniable. A few minutes ago, the room had been full of cruelty and laughter. Now, it was filled with awe. The students felt small, not because he had tried to make them feel that way, but because the truth of his talent left them no other choice. One girl, who had whispered insults under her breath earlier, pressed her hands together tightly on her desk. Her chest ached in a way she didn't understand. She remembered her own dreams she had once been too afraid to chase. The boy's music had touched something deep inside her, and she hated herself for laughing at him before. A boy at the back of the room, the loudest joker, shifted in his chair. He wanted to speak, to crack another joke, to bring the laughter back, but the words refused to come. His throat was dry. Every time he tried to smile, the memory of the melody washed over him, shutting him down. He felt embarrassed, not for the boy at the piano, but for himself. The teacher cleared their throat, trying to regain control of the class. But even they couldn't ignore the power that had just filled the room. Their voice would have sounded weak, foolish, against the silence. So they said nothing. The boy didn't smile or bow. He simply sat there, breathing slowly, his fingers brushing against the piano keys as if he were still connected to the music. He wasn't looking for their applause. He wasn't begging for their approval. His music had been enough. But the silence was too strong to last forever. Someone in the middle row clapped, just once. A single sound, small and uncertain. Then another joined in. Then another. Soon, the entire room was clapping, louder and louder, until it felt like the walls themselves were shaking with the force of it. The boy sat still, stunned. For so long, he had known only their ridicule. Now, the same voices that had once laughed at him were cheering for him, their hands striking together with raw, honest admiration. The teacher, caught between pride and guilt, forced themselves to clap too. Their face burned, their eyes darting away from the boys. They didn't want to admit it, but deep down they knew. He had just taught them a lesson they could never forget. The boy lowered his head slightly, not in shame, but in quiet acceptance. He had never played for their applause, yet hearing it filled him with something he hadn't felt in years: recognition. For once, they weren't looking at him as someone to mock. They were seeing him for who he truly was. The classroom no longer felt like a prison of cruelty. It felt like a stage, one he had conquered with nothing but his hands, his heart, and his courage. The students exchanged looks with one another. Their faces were pale, their eyes full of wonder. Some of them felt guilt eating at their stomachs. Some felt inspired, wishing they had the courage to stand up for themselves the way he just had. And some simply sat in silence, unable to process what they had witnessed. The boy slowly rose from the bench. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His music had spoken for him, louder than any voice could. He stepped away from the piano. And with every step, the clapping grew stronger, fiercer, like waves crashing against the shore. In that moment, the balance of power in the classroom had shifted forever. The boy who had been forced to play as a joke had left them stunned, humbled, and changed. The clapping slowly faded, but the feeling it left behind did not. The classroom was still heavy with something no one could quite explain. The students, who had once been so quick to mock, now sat in their seats with lowered heads and uneasy hearts. Their laughter had turned into awe, and now awe was quietly shifting into guilt. The boy stood silently near the piano. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. His calmness made it worse for them. If he had bragged or shouted, they could have rolled their eyes, pretended not to care. But he didn't. He just stood there. His presence alone, reminding them of how wrong they had been. A girl in the front row blinked hard, fighting back tears. She remembered how she had whispered insults earlier, just to fit in with the others. Now, she couldn't stop hearing the music echoing in her mind. It was as though every note carried a question. Why did you laugh? Why did you join them? She looked at her desk, ashamed to lift her head. At the back of the room, a boy who had shouted the loudest now stared at his hands. He remembered the way he had pointed, the way he had laughed at the boy's trembling fingers. But those same fingers had created magic that he could never dream of making. His stomach twisted. For the first time in his life, he wished he could take his words back. The teacher leaned against the desk, shifting uncomfortably. They had thought this would be a harmless joke, a way to amuse the class and show control. But as the music played, something had broken inside them too. They realized their cruelty had not only failed, but had exposed their own weakness. They had tried to humiliate a child, and instead, the child had revealed a strength far beyond their own. The silence grew. Heavy again, no one dared to speak. The students glanced at each other, their faces pale, their eyes uneasy. It was as if the music had forced them to look in a mirror they didn't want to see. One boy coughed softly, breaking the silence, but even that small sound seemed out of place. The truth was written in every face. They were ashamed. The boy at the piano finally lifted his head and looked at them. He didn't glare, he didn't accuse. His eyes were calm, almost gentle, but that made it harder to bear. His silence was louder than words. It was as if he was saying, "I didn't need to fight you. My music was enough." Some of the students shifted in their chairs, avoiding his gaze. They didn't want to meet his eyes, because, if they did, they would see themselves reflected in the truth. Then it happened softly, unexpectedly. A girl in the corner sniffled. A single tear slid down her cheek before she could wipe it away. She had been one of the first to laugh, and now the guilt was too heavy. She pressed her hands to her face, trying to hide, but everyone had already noticed. The boy didn't move. He didn't need to. His music had already done what words never could, had reached the deepest parts of them. The parts where pride couldn't protect them anymore. The teacher cleared their throat, finally trying to speak. "That's enough," they said, but their voice was shaky, thin. Even they knew the words had no power anymore. The students stayed quiet, but inside, something was changing. For the first time, they began to see the boy differently, not as someone weak or strange, but as someone stronger than all of them. His gift had lifted him above their cruelty, and in doing so, it had left them feeling small. The boy slowly sat back down, his hands resting again on his lap. He didn't look at the piano anymore. He didn't need to. The battle was already won. The students sat in silence, their hearts heavy. Some were ashamed, some were moved, and some were quietly inspired. They knew they would remember this moment forever. It wasn't just about music. It was about truth, about seeing someone's worth when it had been hidden all along. The teacher shifted again, staring at the boy with uneasy eyes. Deep down, even they knew that they had lost something that day. Respect, authority. The boy had taken it, not by force, but by showing them what real strength looked like. And as the quiet stretched on, one thought echoed in every mind. Nothing in this classroom would ever be the same again. Asterisk. The silence in the classroom was thick, almost unbearable. Everyone's hearts still carried the weight of the music they had just heard. The boy sat at the piano, his hands resting quietly in his lap. For a moment, it seemed like it was over, that he had already spoken all he needed to say through the keys. But then, slowly, he lifted his hands again. The students straightened in their seats, unsure of what was coming. Some felt their breath catch. The teacher's eyes widened slightly, though they tried to hide it. And before anyone could blink, the boy began to play once more. This time, there was no hesitation, no trembling. His fingers struck the keys with absolute confidence. The sound was bold, commanding, alive. It wasn't soft and secret anymore. It was loud, powerful, and unstoppable. The melody surged like a storm, rising and crashing through the room. It was as if he had been holding back before, and now he was letting everything out. Every insult, every moment of ridicule, every cruel laugh, they all poured into the music. But instead of bitterness, the notes carried strength, triumph, and pride. The students stared in shock. Some leaned forward, their eyes wide. Others covered their mouths, unable to believe what they were hearing. It wasn't just beautiful, it was overwhelming, like standing in front of a wave too big to escape. The boy's body moved with the music. His head swayed, his shoulders followed the rhythm, and his fingers danced faster and faster across the keys. The classroom no longer looked like a classroom. It looked like a concert hall. and he was the master standing at its center. The teacher, who had once smirked in control, now sat frozen. Their ruler, once used to command, rested uselessly on the desk. They could no longer pretend this was a joke. The boy had taken the stage from them and made it his own. The music climbed higher, reaching a peak that sent chills down spines. The notes were sharp and clear, ringing through the air like declarations of truth. Some students blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. Others simply sat in awe, their faces pale with the weight of what they were witnessing. The boy pressed down on the keys with force, unleashing chords that shook the piano, filled the walls, and echoed into their bones. The sound was no longer just music, it was victory. Pure, undeniable victory. Then, as if guiding them on a journey, he slowed. The storm of sound softened into something gentler, calmer, but no less powerful. It was like watching the sea after a great wave, still strong, still vast, but peaceful now. His fingers glided across the keys with grace, leaving trails of beauty in their wake. The students leaned closer, drawn in as if under a spell. Even the faintest note seemed to carry meaning, as though every sound was whispering directly into their hearts. And then it came, the final moment. The boy lifted his hands, pausing just for a breath. Then he struck the last chord, strong and full, letting it ring through the room. The sound lingered, filling every corner, refusing to fade too quickly. It was not just an ending, 'twas a statement. The silence that followed was unlike anything before. It wasn't mocking silence or awkward silence. It was reverence. The kind of silence that comes only when people witness something so powerful that words are too small to follow. The boy opened his eyes and slowly looked around the room. His gaze was steady, unshaken, and calm. He didn't need to speak. The music had said everything. For one long heartbeat, no one moved. No one breathed. Then, from somewhere in the back, a clap rang out. Just one. But it was enough to break the spell. Another clap followed, then another. Within seconds, the room erupted. The applause was thunderous, wild, unstoppable. Students who had once laughed at him now clapped until their palms stung. Some even stood from their chairs, shouting and cheering, unable to hold back their excitement. The same mouths that had once spoken cruelty now shouted praise. The teacher, red-faced and shaken, forced themselves to clap too. They had no choice. To stay silent would have been more humiliating than anything else. The boy sat quietly, watching, his face calm. He didn't bask in their applause. He didn't grin or shout. He simply accepted it, like someone who already knew the truth about himself. Their approval was not what made him strong, it was his music. His heart, his courage. Still, in that moment, the entire room belonged to him. The boy who had been forced onto the piano bench as a joke had turned it into his stage, and the lesson he had given them would echo far longer than the notes of his song. The thunder of applause slowly faded, leaving behind a silence far deeper than the one before. But this silence was different. It was not cruel, not mocking, not empty. It was filled with respect, regret, and something even stronger, understanding. The boy sat at the piano, calm and steady, his hands folded gently in his lap. He didn't move, didn't speak. He didn't need to. His music had already spoken louder than any words ever could. The students who had mocked him sat frozen in their seats, faces pale, eyes heavy. They could still feel the music inside them like an echo that refused to fade. The teacher stood awkwardly near the desk, shifting from foot to foot. Their face, once smug, was now tight with discomfort. They had planned to humiliate him too. Turn him into a joke. Instead, they had given him the very stage that revealed his greatness. And now, standing there, The teacher felt something sharp inside their chest chamber. One girl lowered her head into her arms, tears quietly dripping onto her desk. She couldn't erase the memory of her own laughter, the way she had joined the others so easily. The boy's music had not only silenced her, it had held up a mirror. And what she saw in that mirror was ugly. A boy in the back, who had shouted the cruelest words, clenched his fists under his desk. He wanted to speak, to apologize, but his throat closed up. His chest felt heavy, as if the music had pressed down on him, reminding him of every careless word he had thrown like a stone. The boy at the piano finally stood. Slowly, without rushing, he stepped away from the bench. His shoes tapped softly on the floor as he walked toward his seat. But in those steps, there was no defeat. There was quiet victory. Every head turned to follow him, every eye locked on. His small figure moving through the silence. When he sat down again, he didn't lift his head. He didn't need to. The silence, the stares, the weight in the room, all of it belonged to him now. The teacher cleared their throat, trying to regain authority. That will be enough for today, they muttered, their voice cracking slightly. It was the weakest they had ever sounded. The students didn't even look at them. Their attention remained on the boy, the one they had underestimated, in that moment. Something inside the classroom shifted forever. The students would still laugh in the future, still joke, still tease each other, but they would never forget this day. They would never forget the boy who turned ridicule into respect. The memory of his music would follow them, a quiet reminder. That greatness often hides where no one expects it. Some would carry guilt for years, remembering how they laughed when they should have stood in silence. Others would carry inspiration, remembering that strength can come from the most unlikely places. And the teacher, though they would never admit it out loud, would always remember the shame of being outshone by the very student they had tried to belittle. The boy didn't think about any of that. For him, it wasn't about victory over them. It wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about proving himself right. He had shown his truth, and that was enough. He didn't need their approval anymore because he had already carried the music inside him long before they heard it. Still, deep down, the classroom had changed. The students no longer looked at him as the quiet boy to mock. They looked at him differently now, with a kind of awe, a kind of respect they didn't yet know how to express. As the bell finally rang, its sharp sound cutting through the heavy air, no one jumped from their seats. No one rushed to leave. They moved slowly, quietly, glancing back at the piano and then at the boy, as if they were leaving something sacred behind. The teacher dismissed the class, their voice low. Students shuffled out one by one, but the memory of the music clung to them like a shadow. The boy walked last, his steps calm, his head still lowered. But he wasn't walking out in shame anymore. He was walking out in victory. And though no one said it aloud, every single person in that classroom knew the truth. They had witnessed something unforgettable. What began as cruelty ended as a lesson. They had tried to make him small. Instead, he had made himself great, and they would remember it for the rest of their lives.